Ladies and gentlemen, there's a belt under your seat, so please fasten it.
Greetings, planet Earth, and welcome to the Science and Cocktails. This is a mental projection sent 8 billion years ago at light speed to reach you, Earthlings, exactly now. Here at planet X31, we have decided to initiate a cooperation between the Niels Bohr Institute from the Copenhagen University and Boomsloes, this magnificent cinema, such that science and scientific research can reach all of you, Earthlings. Science on planet Earth only reaches people through the media, and in most cases, distorted. Science in Cocktails tries to give a unique experience such that everyone can interact with the speaker, the scientist, in person. Tonight's special guest was teleported from England to Denmark for the first time. Professor Rupert Sheldrake is a famous author and biologist. His talk of tonight will span a whole wide range of subjects, from the mind to consciousness to genes to morphogenetic fields. An artistic representation of these incredible complex thoughts will be given by the artist Henrik Schütz. And later on, after a session of questions and answers, a key is giving a musical concert that will change your lives forever. End of transmission.
Okay, please welcome Rupert Sheldrake.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening, and I've been staying for the last 2 days here in this unique habitation, and it's been a great experience. I'm going to talk this evening about the mind beyond the brain, the extended mind. And the mind is extended beyond the brain both in space and in time. First, I'm going to talk about the way it extends in space beyond the brain. What I'm going to suggest to you this evening is that the mind extends beyond the brain through fields. We're all familiar with magnetic fields. Magnetic fields are inside magnets, and they extend around them. They're a field of influence, a region of influence around the magnet. They extend invisibly around magnets. We're familiar with the Earth's gravitational field. That's why we're not floating around now. It's inside the Earth, and it extends far beyond the Earth, keeps the moon in its orbit. And we're familiar with the fields of mobile telephones, which are inside the phone and stretch out invisibly beyond them. And what I'm suggesting is that our minds are inside our brains and stretch out invisibly beyond our brains, and we direct them outside our brains in accordance with attention and intention. It's easiest to understand what I'm trying to say in relation to vision and attention. What happens when you see something? Well, everybody knows the standard scientific answer. What happens is that light is reflected from what you're looking at. For example, as you see me now, light's reflected from me, goes through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerves, and then different bits of the brain become active. We know in more detail than ever before which parts of the brain become active through brain scanning. And that's all very good as far as it goes, but it doesn't actually go very far. It just describes what happens in the brain. When you see something, there are two further unexplained aspects. The first is consciousness itself. The brain activity doesn't explain consciousness, and the materialist theory of the mind says that consciousness doesn't actually do anything. It's just a kind of byproduct of the physical activity of the brain. And among philosophers of mind, the very existence of consciousness is called the hard problem, because there's no way it can be solved within the materialist framework. Thanks, Jay. We've got a high-tech answer to the fact I can't see my notes, a candle. Then the second problem is less reflected on, perhaps less known, which is where are the images that you see? You're seeing an image of me now. The standard view is that all your mental activity is inside the brain. The materialist theory, which dominates the academic and medical worlds, is the theory that the mind is the brain, mental activity is brain activity. It's all inside your head. And so that means when you see me standing here now, I and everything else that you're seeing, I'm inside your head. Inside your head, there's a little Rupert standing, talking into a microphone. And the rest of this cinema are also inside your head. If you stand outside and you look at the sky you're seeing is inside your head, because all your experience is supposed to be inside your brain. A recent paper in one of the leading journals in this field was called, "Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky?" And it was written by a materialist philosopher, and he answered, yes, your skull is beyond the sky. When you see the sky, like everything else you experience, it's inside your brain. So your skull must be beyond the sky, and the brain, the skull that you think is here is just a virtual skull created within this perceptual world inside your real skull, which extends around everything you experience. That is the official view. It's pretty implausible. And what I'm suggesting is an alternate theory of vision that's so simple it's hard to understand. And that is that what you see is exactly where it seems to be, outside your brain. When you see me standing here now, your image of me is located here, not inside your head. And your skull is just where it seems to be. In other words, vision involves a two-way process. Light moves into the eyes, changes happen in the brain, and images are projected out to where they seem to be. So when you look at a star, you're projecting out that image of the star. And normally you project things out to where they actually are. If you don't, then you've got an illusion or a hallucination. Fortunately, those are rare. Otherwise, we'd bump into things and we wouldn't be able to survive. So I'm suggesting you project out the images to where they are, and you project them out, I suggest, through fields. They're a kind of field that I call morphic fields. They're invisible, just as radio waves and magnetic fields and the gravitational field are invisible, but nevertheless they're real. So this idea that you're projecting out things through your attention to where things seem to be means that in some way your mind is touching what you look at. Now, this is not an original theory of vision. It's what Plato suggested, it's what Euclid, the great Greek geometer, believed, it's what almost all the ancient Greeks thought, it's what traditional people all over the world think, it's what Hindus and Buddhists think, and it's what everyone in Europe thought until the 17th century with the birth of modern science. And it's also what children under the age of 11 think. Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, showed that until the age of about 10 or 11, the average European child believes that vision involves a two-way process. Light comes in and images are projected out. That's why in Superman comics there are rays coming out of the eyes of Superman. It's how children think of vision. But Piaget said by the age of 10 or 11, the average child learns the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things located inside the head. So most of us have probably been brought up to believe that, simply because that's what everybody else believes, it's what grown-ups seem to believe, it's what teachers tell us. And we've accepted it on faith, and actually without any evidence at all, and no one's ever seen a thought or an image inside a head. So it's just taken for granted. It's a very eccentric theory of vision in the context of human history. And what I'm suggesting this evening is that children have got it more right than grown-ups. What most of us believed till we were 10 or 11 is closer to the truth than what we've been educated to believe since then. But I'm not putting this forward as a philosophical theory, I'm putting it forward as a scientific hypothesis, which means it should be tested. And that means it should be possible to detect whether, when you look at something, your mind is in a sense touching it. Do you, through these fields of the mind, reach out and touch what you're looking at? If so, can you affect what you're looking at just by looking at it? Well, at first that seems an absurd idea, because we've been so brought up to believe it's all inside the brain. But put it in a different way. Think of it looking at another person. If you look at another person from behind when they don't know you're there, you might look through a window so they can't hear you or smell you or anything. Could they detect when they're being looked at? Now, as soon as you ask that, you realize this is a very common experience. The feeling of being looked at from behind is extremely well known. Over 90% of grown-ups and children have experienced it, and I imagine almost everyone in this room has at some time or another. You turn around and there's someone looking at you. Or you look at somebody from behind and they turn and look at you. Most people are familiar with it in the active and the passive mode. There is a slight sex difference. More women than men have experienced being stared at, and more men than women have experienced staring at others and making them turn around. But this is an extremely well-known experience. So when I first got interested in this, because it has such huge implications for our theory of the mind and the nature of the mind and where the mind's located, I looked to see in the scientific literature what studies there'd been on the feeling of being stared at. And I found there'd been virtually none between 1890 and 1985, there were 4 published studies in the whole scientific literature, and most of them showed it was a real effect. But it had been a completely taboo topic among scientists because the mind's supposed to be in the brain, therefore this ought not to happen, and therefore for many scientists it doesn't happen. The fact that most people believe it happens just shows they're victims of superstition. And it's dismissed by skeptics as being mere coincidence. They say you're turning around all the time, occasionally someone's looking at you, you remember that and you forget the millions of times you're wrong. They haven't got a shred of evidence for that assertion. But nevertheless, that's dominated the scientific world for 200 years, that assumption. So how can you test it scientifically? Well, the answer is it's quite easy to test. I've developed several simple tests. The simplest is where people work in pairs. One person sits with a blindfold on their eyes, the other person sits behind them, and in a random series of trials, either looks at the back of their neck or looks away and thinks of something else. And the person has to guess if they're being looked at or not. This test is so simple that a child can do it. And in fact, thousands of children already have done it. It's been done extensively in schools in Britain, Germany, and in the United States. The results have been widely replicated and are overwhelmingly positive. The results come out above chance over and over again. The 50% level is the chance level. The effect is not a big effect. It's usually between 55 and 60%, the hit rate. But when it's repeated hundreds of thousands of times, it's very significant statistically. In these tests, which are very artificial, people become self-conscious, and that inhibits the effect that one's studying. But nevertheless, they give positive results. And this experiment's now been running for 20 years in the Dutch Science Museum in Amsterdam, the Nemo Center. And more than 20,000 people have taken part. It's one of the biggest experiments ever conducted. And the results are overwhelmingly positive and hugely significant statistically. And it reveals, interestingly, that the most sensitive subjects are children of 9 and under. I've found that in my own research. Children are much more sensitive than grown-ups. I think most of us who are grown up are used to walking around cities where we're surrounded by hundreds of strangers and we develop a kind of thick skin. We desensitize ourselves to this phenomenon, but children are much more sensitive. The most sensitive person I've ever tested was my own son when he was 4 years old. Most of my children have been subjects in experiments since they were 4 years old. They're now getting a bit tired of my research projects, but for many years they were my subjects of first resort. This has now been replicated widely. It's being discussed seriously within the scientific world. There was a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies a few years ago on this subject and its implications for the theory of the mind. It's also extremely well known to people whose job it is to watch others. I've interviewed security guards, private detectives, store detectives, police officers, the drug squad at Heathrow Airport, and others who are paid to watch people for a living. And most of them are completely convinced that people can tell when they're being watched. For example, if you go on a training course to become a private detective, one of the first things you learn when you're being trained how to follow people is don't stare at their back, because they'll turn around and shoot, and you'll catch your eye, and they'll know that you're following them. The shooting thing comes from the SAS. The British SAS, when they're training our special forces to stab people in the back, they tell them don't stare at the back of the person you're creeping up behind, because they're likely to shoot you first, turn around and shoot you. And in the martial arts, it's taken for granted that this exists, and they have training programs so that you can become more sensitive to being looked at from behind. If you can tell someone's creeping up to attack you from behind, you're more likely to survive than if you can't tell. Surprisingly, this even works through closed-circuit television. I've interviewed security personnel who watch others through CCTV surveillance systems, and most of them are convinced that people can tell when they're being watched on a CCTV screen. And experiments show that this works through closed-circuit television as well. experiments done in the United States and in Britain and elsewhere have shown that if you measure people's skin resistance with electrodes on their fingers, like a lie detector, it measures emotional arousal, then if you have a closed-circuit television camera pointing at them, when they're looked at by somebody in another room at random intervals, their skin resistance changes. They become emotionally aroused, even if they're unconscious of it, when they're being watched compared with when they're not being watched. So this happens even subconsciously and physiologically. If it happens with one person looking at you on closed-circuit television, it should work with millions looking at you live on TV. And that would be a great experiment. No one's yet done it, but it would be a really exciting experiment for this phenomenon. And it would also tell us something about people in the public eye. They assume that they're just sending out images, but when people are seeing the images, influences may be coming back to influence those who are being watched on television. This works even with animals. A lot of people have found that animals can tell when they're being watched by humans. I interviewed wildlife photographers and hunters to find out if they'd ever noticed that animals could tell when they're being watched by a hidden person looking through a telescope or a telescopic lens. And most of them are convinced they can. Wildlife photographers who watch animals from hides when they're hidden, looking through telephoto lenses, have found that if you look at the animal through the lens, if you don't take the photo quickly, the animal becomes restless and runs away or flies away because it can feel it's being observed. And I think that this evolved under natural conditions in the context of predator-prey relations. Prey animals that could tell when they were being looked at would be more likely to escape than ones that couldn't tell when they were being looked at. And so I think it has a perfectly good biological basis. It works in many kinds of animals. There's been very little investigation of this so far by naturalists or scientists, but many people have observed this with animals. And sleeping animals are very vulnerable. It works with sleeping animals too. Sleeping animals can often be woken up by staring at them. So can sleeping babies. That's why a lot of parents avoid looking at their sleeping babies, because the baby wakes up and they've spent hours trying to get it to go to sleep, so they don't do it. One of my research projects at the moment is to try this out at home with pets. In English we have a saying, the saying is, let sleeping dogs lie. Well, for this experiment the slogan is, don't let sleeping dogs lie. Stare at them and see if you can wake them up. This research fits with almost everybody's experience. The evidence against the feeling of being stared at is virtually zero. There are certainly skeptics who reject it because they say it's impossible and all the evidence must be flawed and people who believe it must be stupid and so on, but those aren't very powerful arguments. They're just expressions of prejudice. So I think the evidence is really strong that this is a real phenomenon. Our minds reach out and in some sense touch what we're looking at and can affect what we're looking at. And I think if you look at a star at night, your mind is reaching out over literally astronomical distances to touch that star. So I think our minds are extended beyond our brains in every act of attention, every time you look at something. And in fact, the word attention comes from a Latin root ad tendere, which means to stretch towards. Ad is towards, tendere is to stretch, as in tent or tension. So in attention, our minds stretch towards things. We direct our minds and our attention, and I think they stretch out almost like invisible pseudopodia from an amoeba to touch what we're looking at. Now, I think our minds also stretch out in other ways, and the other thing I'm going to talk about now is telepathy. I think telepathy is a normal means of communication among animals in social groups. All animals that are social live in groups by definition, and the individuals have to be coordinated in their behavior. This is most obvious when you consider birds in flocks. Here you see a flock of starlings flying together. And here you see flocks of starlings turning. In England, we have huge flocks of starlings in the winter. They migrate to England from Northern Europe. I don't know whether the Danish ones go to England, but maybe they stay here. But they go from the far north of Europe, at any rate, to England, and thousands of them fly together in the evenings before they roost. And they turn very rapidly without bumping into each other. How do they know where the others are and where the others are going to go? This is a big mystery. Early computer models of this treated it as if they just look at their neighbors. But it's much more complicated than that. They do it too fast to be looking at their neighbors and just responding to them. The latest computer models treat this as a field phenomenon, and the whole flock is like a field. There's a field of the whole flock, and as the field changes, the birds respond to the field around them, like iron filings respond to magnetic fields. And I think there is indeed a field around groups of animals. It's another example of what I call a morphic field. The word morphic comes from the Greek word morphe, meaning form or shape. And so I think they're shaped by a field that links together members of the group. And the same is true of schools of fish. Here you see a group of thousands of fish. And if a predator approaches them, they all flash, there's a flash expansion. They move away from the predator, accelerating extremely fast, but without bumping into each other. They know where the others are going to go. Again, I think it's a field phenomenon. So I think that all social animals have fields that link the members of the group. A pack of wolves, for example, has a field that links the group together. And when the group splits up, for example, when the adults go hunting, leaving the cubs in the den, usually with a babysitter, the field that links them isn't broken, it stretches. It's a bit like an invisible elastic band that stretches out and continues to connect the separated members of the group. And I think that field connection between separated members of a group is the basis of telepathic communication. A change in one can affect the others through this shared field. In other words, I'm suggesting telepathy is a normal means of communication, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural, a perfectly normal part of biological communication between animals. The closest analogy in physics to this is quantum non-locality. In quantum theory, if two particles have been part of the same system, and if they move apart, they remain connected or entangled, so that a change in one instantly results in a change in the other. This is called quantum non-locality, quantum entanglement, or quantum non-separability. Einstein was one of the first to realize this happened, and he thought that quantum theory must be wrong, because he said if this is true, it means quantum theory allows what he called a spooky action at a distance. And he thought spooky action at a distance was impossible, so quantum theory must be wrong. Well, it turns out that quantum theory is right, and this effect is now being applied commercially in quantum computing and quantum cryptography. So there's no doubt it occurs. It's one of the weirdest aspects of quantum theory. And one of the things about it is that it does not fall off with distance. Most things in physics fall off with distance, but this doesn't. And it's the closest analogy to telepathy. Some parapsychologists even suggest that telepathy involves the entanglement of minds. Dean Radin wrote a book called Entangled Minds, in which he puts forward this idea. What I'm saying is similar. Morphic fields may be very similar to quantum fields, but I'm not sure whether they are or not, so I leave that question open. Because I think this is a normal means of communication among animals, I've studied it with animals primarily. And it's easiest to study it with the animals we know best, domestic animals like dogs and cats. I started asking friends and family members if they'd ever noticed their dog or cat could pick up their intentions or thoughts. And I soon heard many fascinating stories. For example, my neighbour in my hometown in England, Newark-on-Trent, was a widow whose son was a merchant seaman. He was in the Navy. And when he came home on leave, he didn't tell her when he was coming because he didn't want her to worry in case he was late. But she always knew when he was coming several hours in advance because the cat used to go and sit at the front door. And it always did that when it knew he was coming home. So she had 3 or 4 hours warning before he came home, time to go and buy some food, get his bedroom ready. So I said to her, how do you think that happened? And she said, I don't know, but the cat just knew. It's very fond of him. For her, it wasn't something she thought about, she just completely accepted it. And I heard many, many other stories, and then I started collecting stories. I appealed for information through BBC radio and television and through British newspapers. And soon I had hundreds, and then later thousands of stories from people about animals doing things that suggest they can pick up thoughts or intentions. I then did appeals for information in Germany, and then I had a big appeal in France. I gave a talk in France, and the question that interested the French was, are French pets more sensitive than British pets? So they launched a big appeal through French newspapers and French television. And it turned out that French pets actually are more sensitive than British pets. I have a huge database, more than 5,000 of these stories. Sometimes people say, you shouldn't listen to people's stories, they're just anecdotes. I looked up the word anecdote in the dictionary, and what an anecdote is, it comes from a Greek root, an ekdotos. An means not, ekdotos means published. An anecdote is an unpublished story. When it's published, it's promoted to the rank of a case history. And most of medicine is based on case histories, published anecdotes. But I think that what the importance of this is that, for me, the plural of anecdote is data. And if thousands of people observe things about their animals independently, this suggests something's going on. And most scientists say, ignore what ordinary people say. They're ignorant, they're doting on their pets, they're not scientific, and so forth. I think that's totally the wrong attitude. I think we have to start from people's experience. Empirical means experience. And so empirical science should be based on experience. Charles Darwin based most of his research on the experience of plant breeders and travelers and explorers. Very little of it was based on laboratory research. It was based on experience. So what I've done is start from this classification of these experiences, which gives a natural history of what people observe with their animals. Then I do surveys to find out how common this is. For example, we have more than 200 accounts of people who think their cats know when they're planning to take the cat to the vet. The cat disappears. Most cats hate going to the vet, and if they think their owners are going to take them there, they hide. After this has happened several times, most people try to avoid giving the cat any clues. They don't get out the carrying basket so the cat can see it. They try to avoid mentioning the word vet, and the cat still seems to know. And some people in despair telephone the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation. And then they go home after work to pick up the cat and take it to the vet, and it's still not there. We heard so many of these stories that we did a survey of vets. We rang up all 65 vets in the North London Yellow Pages, and we asked them if they ever had a problem with people missing appointments with cats. 64 out of 65 said, yes, it happens all the time. And the one exception said it happens so often they'd given up the appointment system for cats. Here's one area where lots of people tell the story. It does seem to be very common, and it seems to suggest the cats can pick up their owner's intentions. But the phenomenon that's easiest to investigate is again, a very common phenomenon where dogs and cats and some other pets know when their owners are coming home. They go and wait at a door or a window when the person's on the way home, and the people at home know when they're coming by seeing the dog go and start waiting. This is very common. We've done random household surveys that show about 50% of dogs anticipate their owner's arrivals and about 30% of cats. I don't think cats are necessarily less sensitive, but some of them are less interested. And so we have this very common phenomenon. And when I've got over 1,000 stories on dogs that know when their owners are coming home. And most people don't think it's anything extraordinary if it's a routine thing, the same time every day. But some people come home at different times every day, and the dog still knows. And most people don't think it's strange if it's just a minute or two in advance, because the dog could hear footsteps or a familiar car, or in Denmark, a familiar bicycle. But it happens even when people travel by public transport, by trains or bus. And so it's not just familiar sounds, it's not just routine. So this seems to be an extremely common form of behavior. I'm sure there are millions of dogs and cats doing it in Denmark itself, or probably hundreds of thousands. So what's going on? I looked in the scientific literature to see what investigations there'd been on this phenomenon. I found there were none at all, absolutely none. And when I discussed it with my scientific friends, they just dismissed it. They said, oh, these people are just making it up, or they're not noticing that the dog goes there all the time, and it's just a coincidence. But one of my scientific friends was different, a psychologist at Cambridge called Nicholas Humphrey. He said, oh, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home at least half an hour in advance. So I said to him, well, how do you think it did that? Surely it couldn't have heard your car from more than 20 miles away. He said, oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got. And because he's a great skeptic, and he and I have been arguing for years about these things, we try and resolve our differences by thinking of experiments. And that's what triggered off experimental research. And so what I do in my experiments is I have people go at least 8 kilometers from home. They stay out and don't know when they're coming home till I tell them to come home at a random time by telephone. The people at home don't know when they're coming. Sometimes there are no people at home. We film the place where the dog waits the whole time that they're away from their home. So we've got a complete record with time code of the dog's behavior. And we do these experiments over and over again. I've done hundreds of these videotaped experiments. If you do hundreds of experiments on telepathy in humans, they usually get bored of the telepathy tests and the scores fall off. But dogs luckily never get bored of their owners coming home. And so you can do this over and over again. I've got a lot of statistical data, published data. This is all published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and you can see the details on my website. You can also read about them in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which covers a whole range of unexplained powers of animals. It covers cats, horses, and parrots as well. And it covers many other kinds of telepathy, the sense of direction, and premonitions, including premonitions of earthquakes. But the key thing here are these, gives you all the data in a summarized form. So there's a lot of evidence that animals can pick up people's intentions. And rather than show you all the scientific data, I'll now show you a video showing one of these dog experiments conducted in England. This experiment was done by Austrian State Television, ORF, who sent a crew to film this experiment in England. That explains what otherwise might be puzzling, that the soundtrack is in German. For those of you who don't understand German, basically what's going on is that the owner normally leaves her dog with her the parents just sit there with the dog, and in this experiment, the dog was filmed the whole time that she was out. There was a cameraman filming the dog. He didn't know when she was coming home. Her parents didn't know when she was coming home. And another cameraman filmed her wherever she went. And when they tell her to come home, which is 3 hours, 50 minutes after she went out, oh, well done. It goes into a split screen, and you can see what the dog does as she decides to go home, as she's told to go home.